The sentence is life. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed off the walls. People leaned forward, unable to believe what they were hearing. The judge, stone-faced and immovable, had just handed down a verdict that would change someone's entire life. The defendant slumped in his chair, his hands trembled, his eyes were wide, trying to process the weight of a lifetime behind bars. Friends and family sat frozen, staring in shock. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras flashed, and whispers spread like wildfire. The tension in the room was unbearable. In the back row, Steven Seagal sat completely calm. His expression was unreadable. While everyone else reacted with panic, anger, or despair, he simply observed, quietly calculating his next move. To the casual observer, he looked like just another spectator, jeans, a leather jacket, shades hiding his eyes. But inside, he was anything but ordinary. No one in that room could have predicted what would happen next. The judge, proud of his authority, believed the case was closed, the defendant's fate sealed. And yet, Steven reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved with precision, dialing a number that, for most people, would be unthinkable. "I need to call my dad," Steven said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for the attentive few to hear. A ripple ran through the courtroom. "His dad? Wait, the U.S. Attorney General?" Someone whispered from the back. Eyes darted around and jaws dropped. Cameras focused on him, reporters raising their pens and spectators holding their breath. The courtroom, which had been alive with tension, now felt frozen in disbelief. People exchanged nervous glances. Some leaned forward, straining to hear the conversation that hadn't even started yet. The weight of anticipation was palpable. Steven's calm presence in the eye of the storm was magnetic. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. All eyes were on him as he prepared to make a call that could change the course of the trial and perhaps the lives of everyone in the room. This wasn't just a phone call. It was a statement, a silent warning, and everyone knew, deep down, that the game had just changed. And then finally, he pressed the call button. The trial had been dragging on for months. Endless hearings, stacks of documents, witnesses taking the stand, cross-examinations that felt like duels. Every detail mattered. Every word spoken could tip the scales of justice. And now, in this packed courtroom, it all came down to a single devastating sentence: life. The defendant, a young man who had once been full of hope, now sat slumped in his chair. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembling, his eyes searching for a miracle that would never come, at least not in the way anyone expected. Friends and family sat frozen, stunned into silence. Some covered their mouths, others had tears streaming down their faces. Cameras flashed and journalists scribbled furiously, capturing every moment for the public record. The weight of finality hung thick in the air. The judge, a man known for his strict demeanor and zero tolerance for nonsense, leaned back in his chair. His gavel lay idle on the desk, a symbol of authority he wielded effortlessly. He believed his job was done. The sentence had been delivered. Justice in his eyes had been served. Yet, he didn't realize that in the back of the courtroom, one man was quietly observing, analyzing, calculating, and preparing to act in a way that would turn everything upside down. Steven Seagal sat there with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. His presence was understated, a plain leather jacket, jeans, and dark sunglasses concealing his eyes. No flashy gestures, no overt reactions, just stillness. But that stillness carried weight. There was an intensity in the way he sat, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the measured way he held his phone. You could almost feel that he was already 3 moves ahead of everyone else in that room. No one knew why he was here. Spectators assumed he was a relative or a supporter. Lawyers assumed he was another curious onlooker. But the truth was far more powerful. Steven was not just a guest in this courtroom. He had the influence, the connections, and the presence to change the outcome, and he knew exactly how to use them. As the defendant tried to gather himself, muttering something inaudible under his breath, Steven pulled out his phone. The action was casual, almost natural, but it sent a ripple through the room. A murmur spread among the spectators. Is he really calling? Eyes darted from him to the phone, then to the back row, where journalists tried to catch a glimpse. The U.S. Attorney General? Someone whispered, incredulous. The words barely escaped their lips before the courtroom went almost silent. Everyone sensed that the normal rules of procedure were about to be tested. The room, once alive with whispers and speculation, became tense with anticipation. Lawyers leaned forward, trying to catch every subtle movement. Even the judge, proud and authoritative, seemed momentarily uneasy, as if he sensed that the sentence he had just passed might not be the final word. Steven's voice, calm and collected, cut through the tension. "I need to speak to my dad." A simple sentence, yet it carried more weight than any gavel, any law, any judgment. And with that, he dialed. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Phones were forgotten, pens paused mid-scribble, and every eye turned toward him. It was the calm before a storm that no one in that room could have predicted. Because one phone call, one single call, had the power to change everything. The courtroom remained frozen in silence as Steven Seagal's fingers hovered over the phone. Every eye followed his movements. Lawyers, reporters, spectators, all sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. The judge, confident just moments ago, now shifted uneasily in his seat. He had handed down what he thought was an unassailable sentence, and yet the presence of this one man in the back of the courtroom seemed to challenge that authority without a single word. The defendant's hands shook as he stared at Steven. He had seen the calm intensity in those eyes before, on the set, in films, in interviews, but he had never imagined it would carry this kind of weight in a real-life situation. There was no acting here, no performance. This was real power, quiet and absolute, and everyone could feel it. Steven's phone rang once, twice, the seconds stretching into what felt like an eternity. A whisper ran through the courtroom. "Is he really calling the Attorney General?" The murmurs grew, but no one dared speak too loudly. Even the judge seemed to sense that this was no ordinary interruption. The gavel, once a symbol of his unquestioned authority, now seemed almost fragile in his hand. Finally, a voice answered, calm, measured, unmistakably authoritative. "Yes, Steven, what is this about?" Steven spoke clearly, his voice low but confident. "Sir, the verdict just delivered in this courtroom. It overlooks critical evidence. There are discrepancies in the case files, and the consequences for the defendant could be life-altering. I need your guidance immediately." The courtroom felt the shift instantly. Lawyers exchanged alarmed glances. Reporters leaned forward, sensing a story far bigger than a standard trial. The defendant, previously resigned to his fate, suddenly sat upright, hope flickering in his eyes. The judge's expression tightened. He had never faced interference like this before. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tense, "but this is highly irregular. Court procedure." Steven didn't respond to the judge. Instead, he continued his conversation, detailing inconsistencies in the evidence, highlighting overlooked witnesses, and pointing out procedural errors that no one else had noticed. His calm, authoritative tone contrasted sharply with the panic and confusion spreading through the courtroom. A low murmur spread among the spectators. Some whispered, "This could overturn the whole trial." Others simply stared, unable to comprehend the unfolding events. The tension was almost unbearable. The judge tried to maintain control, but even he could not ignore the weight of influence Steven wielded with a single phone call. Minutes passed, though it felt much longer. The Attorney General listened intently, asking questions, clarifying details, and promising immediate action. Steven remained composed, unwavering, letting the official authority flow through him without needing to raise his voice or demand attention. Finally, the judge leaned back, clearly unsettled. For the first time in the trial, he was not the center of power. The courtroom, which had moments ago been ruled by law and procedure, now hung on the balance of a conversation, one that could change everything in a single instant. And as Steven's conversation continued, everyone realized that the outcome of this trial was no longer predictable. The life sentence, once considered absolute, was now in question. One phone call had shifted the balance of power. One man's calm determination had turned the courtroom into a stage where influence, authority, and justice collided. And in that moment, everyone understood this was not just about law. It was about strategy, presence, and knowing exactly when to act. The courtroom was tense, every person inside feeling the shift in the air. What had once been a predictable final judgment was now hanging by a thread, and it was all because of one phone call. Steven Seagal remained calm, composed, almost serene, but the effect of his presence was undeniable. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle movement in the room seemed magnified. The defendant sat frozen at first, his mind racing. For months he had resigned himself to the life sentence that had been handed down. But now, as he watched Steven speak with the highest legal authority in the country, a glimmer of hope sparked within him. His hands stopped trembling, his posture straightened, and he leaned forward, listening intently. He couldn't believe this was happening. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Lawyers at the defense table were exchanging frantic glances. Some were astonished, some confused, and some quietly relieved. They knew that the influence of the U.S. Attorney General could change the course of the case entirely. Papers rustled nervously, pens paused mid-note, and every detail they had meticulously prepared seemed to pale in comparison to the power being exercised through a simple phone call. Even the judge, who had moments ago been unshakable, now showed cracks in his composure. His brow furrowed, his hands clenched slightly around the gavel, and he leaned back in his chair, trying to maintain control. But control was slipping. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted from routine procedure to high-stakes anticipation. Everyone could feel it. Every eye was on Steven, and through him, on the phone conversation that was silently rewriting the rules of the trial. Spectators whispered, trying to piece together what was happening. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Steven's calm demeanor, his focused expression, and the subtle intensity that seemed to radiate from him. Reporters scribbled furiously, their articles forming in real time. Seagal intervention could change verdict. Nobody knew exactly what had been said, but the message was clear. The courtroom was no longer operating under its usual rules. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then a ripple went through the room. The clerk, who had been quietly observing, whispered to a colleague, This could actually work. He's changing everything." The judge's assistant glanced nervously at the bench. The defendant's family clutched each other's hands, holding their breath as the impossible unfolded before them. Steven ended the call with the same calm precision he had begun with. He pocketed the phone, leaned back slightly, and allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod. That nod, subtle as it was, carried authority. It was the silent confirmation that action was being taken, that the tide had shifted, and that the courtroom was now on a new path, one that no one had anticipated. The reaction was immediate. Lawyers whispered to each other, spectators murmured, and the defendant's eyes filled with tears. The weight of despair that had been suffocating him moments ago was replaced with cautious optimism. Even the judge, though maintaining his formal posture, could not hide the uncertainty flickering across his face. Every person in that courtroom realized something profound. This was not just about law, procedure, or power. It was about influence, calm authority, and timing. And the man who had just wielded it so effortlessly sat quietly in the back row, seemingly unaffected by the chaos his actions had created. For the first time in the trial, the courtroom understood that the verdict was no longer final, and in that silence, charged with tension and anticipation, everyone waited to see what would happen next. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Seconds stretched into minutes as everyone waited for the next move. Steven Seagal remained calm, almost statuesque, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. His eyes scanned the room, noting every subtle reaction. The whispered questions, the anxious glances, the shifting of papers, and the faint tremble in the defendant's hands. Then, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 3 men in sharp suits stepped in, carrying thick folders and official-looking documents. They moved with precision and authority, their expressions serious, commanding the attention of everyone present. The murmurs that had filled the room moments ago fell silent. Even the judge, who prided himself on control and composure, froze mid-sentence, his gavel hovering in the air. One of the executives approached Steven directly. "Sir," he said, voice steady but urgent, "we've been waiting for you. The case files need your immediate review." A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. Spectators gasped. Lawyers paused in mid-conversation. Cameras snapped furiously, trying to capture the unexpected entrance and the sudden shift in power dynamics. The judge's eyes widened slightly. His authority, previously unquestioned, was suddenly overshadowed by the arrival of men carrying the highest levels of official power. The defendant's family looked on in disbelief. Their hope, once fragile and flickering, now surged with a sense of certainty they hadn't dared to feel moments ago. The young man in the defendant's chair whispered to his lawyer, Is this really happening?" His lawyer, still stunned, could only nod, unable to articulate the gravity of the moment. The judge attempted to regain control, his voice firm but faltering slightly. "Excuse me, may I ask who these individuals are?" One of the executives turned, meeting the judge's gaze without hesitation. "Your Honor, these men represent the Office of the U.S. Attorney General. Mr. Seagal has alerted us to critical discrepancies in the case, and we have arrived to ensure justice is properly served." The courtroom erupted into murmurs and astonished whispers. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every stunned expression. The staff, once confident in the finality of the verdict, now exchanged confused and worried glances. Some of the reporters quickly typed updates into their devices, already realizing that they were witnessing a historic moment. A courtroom drama unlike anything seen before. The defendant's eyes widened as Steven turned slightly toward him. "I came here to support justice," he said quietly, "not just to watch it unfold. And sometimes justice requires action beyond what you see in the courtroom." The judge, who had moments ago seemed untouchable, now leaned back in his chair, clearly aware that the balance of power had shifted. The gavel that had symbolized absolute authority now seemed almost ceremonial. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the undeniable influence Steven wielded, not through force, but through preparation, calm, and connections that reached the highest offices in the country. A tense silence followed as the executives spread the case files across the bench. The defendant, the lawyers, and the spectators all watched as the verdict, once considered final, was now subject to review by the very office that oversaw justice on a national level. And in that moment, one thing became clear to everyone in the courtroom. The outcome of this trial was no longer in the hands of a single judge. It was now guided by calm authority, preparation, and the decisive presence of a man who had quietly waited for the right moment to act. Steven Seagal's call had changed everything. The courtroom was tense as the executives spread the case files across the judge's bench. Every person in the room leaned forward, watching intently. Reporters snapped photos, pens hovered over notepads, and spectators held their breath. The weight of the previous verdict still lingered in the air, but now it was replaced with cautious anticipation. The atmosphere had shifted from despair to suspense, and everyone knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Steven Seagal remained seated in the back, calm as ever. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every reaction, every subtle movement. The defendant, who had moments ago felt the crushing weight of a life sentence, now sat upright, hope sparking in his eyes. His lawyer whispered quietly, barely audible over the courtroom murmur, This could change everything." The executives reviewed the files with precision, pointing out inconsistencies, overlooked evidence, and procedural errors. They spoke with authority, explaining clearly why the original verdict might have been flawed. The judge, who had once been so confident in his ruling, now leaned forward, listening carefully, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. The gavel, once a symbol of absolute power, sat unused, a reminder that even authority has limits. Moments passed, though it felt like hours. Then the lead executive looked at the judge and said firmly, "Your Honor, after reviewing the files, we recommend a reassessment of the case. The evidence and procedural errors indicate that the initial sentence may not reflect the full truth." The judge's face paled. He cleared his throat, attempting to maintain composure. I see. This is highly irregular, but I will comply with the review process." His voice trembled slightly, a crack in his usually unshakable facade. The courtroom erupted into murmurs and whispers. The defendant's family held each other tightly, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Some reporters even stood, applauding quietly, recognizing the gravity of what had just occurred. For months, the defendant had been preparing for a life sentence, and now hope, real, tangible hope, had returned. Steven stood, finally moving from his seat, his calm aura radiating through the room. He walked toward the defendant and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, justice needs a steady hand and the right timing," he said softly. "Today, you got both." The judge, still stunned but regaining a fraction of his composure, nodded slowly. "I will follow the recommendations of the Attorney General's office. A new hearing will be scheduled, and all relevant evidence will be re-examined." The defendant exhaled deeply, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. He turned to Steven and whispered, "Thank you." I don't know how to repay you. Stephen merely nodded, a small smile touching his lips. Focus on moving forward, he said. That's repayment enough. The courtroom slowly began to empty, but the atmosphere had changed. What had once been a place of despair was now filled with a quiet sense of justice and hope. Lawyers discussed the new proceedings, reporters filed their breaking stories, and spectators left, talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. Stephen walked out of the courthouse, calm as ever, his presence leaving a lasting impression on everyone inside. The defendant, now filled with renewed hope, knew that his life had been given a second chance, and the judge, humbled by the experience, would never forget the day when influence, calm authority, and decisive action had rewritten the course of justice. Justice had been served not through anger, intimidation, or force, but through patience, preparation, and the quiet power of knowing when and how to act. The courtroom was quiet now, but the echoes of what had just occurred lingered in the air. Every person who had been present, from the judge to the spectators, from the lawyers to the reporters, knew that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The verdict, once thought final, had been challenged not with anger, not with intimidation, but with calm authority, preparation, and the courage to act at the right moment. Steven Seagal, having orchestrated this subtle yet decisive intervention, walked out of the courthouse with the same quiet confidence he had maintained throughout the trial. He did not need applause, recognition, or headlines. His presence alone had been enough to shift the balance of power, to remind everyone in that room that influence and integrity often speak louder than force or authority. The defendant, whose life had been hanging in the balance, followed behind him, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and awe. For months, he had felt trapped by the weight of the law, believing that nothing could change his fate. Yet today, through the actions of a single person who remained calm under pressure, hope had been restored. He realized something profound. Sometimes, life-changing interventions do not come from shouting or demanding attention. They come from clarity, strategic action, and knowing exactly when to act. The judge, still seated in the courtroom moments ago, had been forced to confront a truth many people never face: that authority, while powerful, is not absolute. Even a verdict pronounced with confidence can be re-examined when justice demands it. The experience humbled him, and he would leave that courtroom with a deeper understanding of fairness, humility, and the importance of listening to reason over ego. As the news of the intervention spread, reporters scrambled to capture every detail, trying to convey to the public what had transpired. But even their articles could not fully capture the essence of what had occurred, the quiet power of patience, preparation, and decisive action. It was a lesson that went beyond the courtroom, a reminder that influence and respect are earned through integrity, not fear. For everyone present, there was a moral that could not be ignored. Respect is not conditional. It is not reserved for the powerful, the wealthy, or those in positions of authority. True respect is shown to everyone, because one day the person you underestimate or overlook may be the one with the ability to shape your life, your decisions, and your world. Stephen's intervention was more than a legal maneuver. It was a demonstration of a principle that applies far beyond this courtroom. Patience, calmness, and timing are as important as knowledge and skill. Courage is not only about confrontation, it is also about knowing when to act, how to act, and who to involve in order to achieve a just outcome. As the courthouse emptied, the lessons of that day echoed silently in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The defendant had been given a second chance, the judge had been reminded of humility, and the spectators had been shown the extraordinary impact one person can have when they act with purpose and precision. And Steven Seagal, he walked away quietly, leaving the courtroom behind, but leaving an indelible impression on everyone inside. True power is silent, true respect is earned, and sometimes the right action at the right moment can change everything, not just for one person, but for everyone, watching, learning, and witnessing the unfolding of justice. If you believe in the power of calm authority, timing, and respect, type respect in the comments and share where you're watching from. Remember, true influence is not loud, it is measured, precise, and impactful.